Okay, yeah, so we're in the context of the theme of vision and transformation. And I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago about ethics. And as been said, I have this desire to keep things fairly simple, actually, and practical. I'm interested in how we bring it into our lives. And to, again, the Dharma is actually very simple. But also very profound. It's us who need to try and align our being to it. So the essence of the Dharma is pratitya samuppada. All things arise in dependence upon conditions. Condition co-production. And we, again, even this week, these last few weeks, we've seen how actions have consequences. Not only a small action in one part of the world can affect what happens in the rest of the world. And again, this was emphasized in the last words of the Buddha, all things are conditioned, with mindfulness strive on. And what we're striving to do is to transcend the subject-object dichotomy, the self-other illusion as such, and to be aware of the ultimate lack of separation between self and other. And again, the importance of the precepts from the point of view where they point us towards the mental states. It's not just what we do, it's the mental states behind that, and seeking to transcend negative mental states, in particular the three poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion or ignorance. So I'm going to say a bit more about myself, and also about what's happened in the last few days and my responses to that, and seek to put that within some kind of Buddhist perspective, although I feel that what I do, I'm a Dharmachari, so I seek to dwell in the Dharma. So it's not for me just a theoretical thing, but I will nonetheless be sharing some of my reflections. So I have mentioned my background in the past, and but I'll run through it quickly to give a bit of perspective. So I was born in 1961, so the early 60s, which was a very young age, of course. And my mother was from Scotland of Jewish-Polish descent, and my father was from the Caribbean. My mother was a waitress, and my father was a man of letters. That is, he worked in the post office, sorting letters. So my father was one of those people who was invited by this government to come over and work in some of the key areas that nobody else, or very few people, wanted to work in at that time. So many West Indians, as you probably know, the Windrush generation, came over, but many went to work on London transport, and many went into the post office. And it's interesting reflecting that all of his friends, or nearly all of his friends, were other West Indians at the time. They were keeping to themselves as such. I mean, I could go into the detail of the reasons, but I'm sure you could work that out at that time. So, yes, I'm black, I'm white, I'm Jewish, I'm Buddhist. So, and also I'm bald as well. And I come from a working class background and ended up in a middle class profession. And I wear glasses as well. So I over the years have had a reasonable amount of prejudice and discrimination for any one of those things. The interesting thing that comes up here is about identity. So in the early 60s, when I was born, there was still a lot of segregation. There was segregation in South Africa, apartheid. There was segregation in the United States of America, particularly in the South. Of course, that that wasn't, segregation didn't really stop until the 70s, if it ever did stop. And of course, there's segregation in the UK, and not least Bristol. Bristol, it still could be seen as one of the most segregated cities in the country. And also there was a shift in the 60s from the British Empire shrinking. So places like Barbados, Jamaica, Malta, Cyprus, all by about 1965 gained independence as such, although they're still part of the Commonwealth. So I was born into this, sort of mixed background, poor background, classic council estate in London. And I was different. We were the only kind of black family on the estate at that time. No, in fact, there was one other. Yeah. And so who am I? You say, who was I when I was growing up? And I received discrimination from white people. I received discrimination from black people. And that was part of what I had to deal with, and that's that's what made my character as such, as how I responded to that. My family was not was not an academic family, and so when I went to school, I wasn't encouraged at home into education. Although my father always told me to be educated. He didn't actually spend much time in helping me in that endeavor. So I went to school, and when I got, I'm picking out a memory of when I went to secondary school, and I hadn't really been taught maths that well. So when I went to secondary school, there's a whole new areas of maths which I hadn't encountered before and didn't know how to do. And so the teacher at the time, the very same teacher called me stupid because I didn't know how to do it. Of course, that was his job to tell me. And he also called me a gollywog at that time, because when I was younger, up until the age of about 18, I did actually have an afro. And it's one of those bizarre things in life where I probably looked more mixed race then than I do now, or more obviously so. Prejudice and discrimination was an everyday thing, and but I also had this awareness. I mean, my name was Patrice. I was named after Patrice Lumumba, so my father did have an interest in politics, and he became a very important person in African and worldwide politics, because he was the first Prime Minister of the independent Congo and was assassinated by US-backed forces because he was quite left-wing. So, I had to develop a certain resilience to survive in those kind of circumstances. And I had to there was kind of a point, I don't know if it evolved or whether there was a particular point, where I decided that I wanted to retain my peace of mind. And to retain that peace of mind, I was not going to allow others to take that away from me by their words or their discrimination. And that when I was insulted or called names, it suddenly occurred to me that actually there was no point in me taking offense at this, because all they were insulting was themselves, and they were residing in these negative mental states. I was reminded of this again recently when I was cycling through town, and this van, as I was turning, was bibbing me because obviously I wasn't going fast enough for him. And I actually happened to catch him up, and I just said, why were you bibbing at me? And of course, I wasn't shouting, I was fairly calm, but he chose to respond with various kinds of insults. And all of a sudden, I could just feel this compassion arise. I could see that this person was suffering. He was very unhappy, and he was certainly dwelling in negative mental states. So this was I came to this obviously over many years of practice, and certainly accelerated when I came to the Dharma. And although I certainly saw the importance of knowledge, understanding, and compassion, and that people like that need it even more. And when I was at school, when I first went to school, I couldn't understand why people were unkind to each other. It was just a natural kind of response. I wanted to get on and be nice with each other. So that's a little bit of my background. So so recently, obviously we've been in very unusual times, and and there was a key event which happened this week after the series of conditions. So some of the conditions are we've been in lockdown. Conditions were that there was an event in America with George Floyd, and that led to many other conditions opening up, leading to what happened in Bristol on Sunday. And this affected me deeply, and I was quite keen to look at the news and seeing how people were responding, and seeing this emergence of the Black Lives Matter swell of emotion and response. And although interestingly enough, with the statue coming down, I mean, that is potentially violent action, but no one was harmed in it as such. So I was looking at the responses, and in particular at the criticisms, because when I was growing up, I naturally wanted to ignore different points of view and just wanted to be with sort of the views that agreed with me. Then as I realized that actually those other voices needed to be heard. And for me to actually try and understand, and obviously these days bring forth compassion. So some of the key criticisms were that it was violent, that it was unlawful, and that, of course, that it was breaking the rules of lockdown and COVID-19, and that was fair enough. But another body of criticism was that many people were saying, well, all lives matter, and then I was looking at it, and I was looking at the responses, and I know there's a bigger organisation, and I realised that there was two kind of strands to this. That some of the people, they were earnestly kind of looking for, using this quote, this term, looking for some kind of justice or equality or for all. And I think that probably comes from a basic ignorance of what the Black Lives Matter is about. So ignorance is a sense of not knowing, and if you like, from a Buddhist perspective, it's the poison of delusion, yeah, and perhaps even an attachment to dogma. And but the other strand, and obviously the more worrying one, is the ones which are willfully ignorant and maybe racist, and willful ignorance is not wanting to know or to understand another point of view. So I mean, it's one thing to be ignorant, to not knowing something, but it's another thing to actually willfully not want to know anymore and hold on, attached to a particular dogma or point of view. And of course, it comes from traditional kind of issues around prejudice. Prejudice is to prejudge. is to come from a judgment about someone or something without really knowing much about them. And that comes, if we look at what that comes from, what the conditions there that set that up, it's fear, insecurity, lack of knowledge and maybe experience, and education. And some people just haven't had the experience. Some of it is understandable. They may not have had an experience of being around people of other faiths, colours, or whatever, and they have an innate fear or in that. And along with that, you get the blame culture, but also, interestingly enough, an othering, this reinforcing of self and other. And within the Buddhist context, this not willing to open up to this wider perspective or different perspectives will cover at least two and maybe all three of the three poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion. And how do we combat this? And the Dharma tells us that we combat this with developing compassion, knowledge, understanding, and kindness. So the Buddhist aspect is that, yes, all life matters and is sacred. That's the first precept. It's not harming all living beings. Now, just to go back briefly to the Black Lives Matter, the wider perspective, if you like, and that you have to look at the historicity of this and of what's gone on for over 400 years of slavery and mistreatment of and in America, where as I said, there's segregation, where there native peoples have been destroyed in USA, Canada, Australia, again segregation, and what this can lead to, and even in this country with the Windrush scandal, the war. My father fought in the Royal Air Force, and as did many other Caribbeans and Asian people who also then came to this country. But many of them, for example, who were Christians, had to set up their own churches because they weren't accepted by the white churches in the United Kingdom. So black churches are not necessarily by choice. It was out of necessity because many of them were not allowed or distinctly made unwelcome in the white churches. And then, of course, you've got things like austerity, you've got trauma. And that's an interesting thing because the latest research talks about how you can have trauma through generations. As I said, my mother was of Jewish background, and we certainly had relatives that would have perished in the Holocaust. And you see that it's all very well documented about how that has an effect on future generations. And we see in this country how first, second generation immigrants have this difficulty of trying to marry the different cultures. Austerity, more recently, where a lot of services were cut to help that were helping people. And I was speaking to a friend recently about how there's very high levels of schizophrenia amongst Afro-Caribbeans. And she was saying that the research has said that that's linked to identity, where they have not had their voice heard, or they're in a different culture, and they've had to have a loss of who they are, of insecurity, this feeling of not being accepted, the cultural change, and this can lead to aggression, and sometimes within the families, because they want to keep their families close, they want to protect them naturally enough. And this leads to conflict of values between the generations. And so it gets very, very interesting and complicated. In other cultures, those that had schizophrenia, for example, in Zanzibar, they were considered as sacred as shamans and having special powers, whereas here we treat them very differently. So there is this wider perspective again that comes from the othering. And once you bring in this understanding of why there might be this sort of sense of being downtrodden, this sense of separation and all of the problems that can arise. So, as I said, how do we respond in a dharmic way to these social, political, economic events? And how do we put the Dharma into action? And quite simply, I would say that it's the twofold path of wisdom and compassion. Yeah? And it's also being aware of even our own political and spiritual indignation. And fighting racism, for example, is also being aware of our mental states and what that may do to us. And so it's finding that balance of standing up for what we think is right, but also being aware of our own mental states and how it may affect that. And we do this for the sake of all living beings. Yeah. So the Bodhisattva perspective, which builds on this avoidance of harm to all living beings, the seeking to stretch out compassion, but with a sense of wisdom and understanding to all living beings. It's part of an important strand of the Tree Rattler perspective. It's part of our ordination vows, and it's very much part of the idea of the altruistic dimension of we're not just doing it for ourselves, we're doing it for the sake of all beings. And we only have to look around the centre to see how many dedicated people there are who give their lives to the running of the centre and to help others simply to grow and develop. And so we need to be aware of things that do reinforce the ego. We are seeking to transcend that sense of self that separates us from other. And the simplicity and the depth of the Heart Sutra, I cannot emphasize enough. You do not need to read anything else, I keep saying this, other than the Heart Sutra. And even then, take a line from the Heart Sutra and reflect upon that and be that. And the one for me is holding to anything whatsoever, holding to nothing whatsoever. And it's, I don't always achieve it, but I find that as just a powerful tool to really start to open up that powerful reinforced egos that we have and that we've had to develop for various reasons. And even again, the message in the Heart Sutra is to also be watchful of religious dogma, of over-dependence upon rites and rituals. And of course, the other practical means that we have is the metta bhavana, the development of loving kindness practice that we do. And if you're getting off the cushion and you're still finding yourself grumpy and you can't be nice to the dog or people around you, the practice is actually about developing how we interact with the world when we get off the cushion. The metta bhavana is an off the cushion practice. We practice how to develop it and how to open up, but ultimately it's what we do off the cushion. And So we are seeking constantly to bring awareness to where we have the three poisons of greed, of hatred, and delusion or ignorance, and how we respond to this in others, which is interesting, how we respond to this in others. And it's interesting that the aspect of the teachings of Jesus that's always struck me, having taught the 6 world religions and more for many years, was love your enemies. It really was the essence of Christianity for me, and which also brought it very, not inconsistent with Buddhist teachings. So again, the first precept, which I said a couple of weeks ago, to avoid harm from all living beings, is actually setting up all the other precepts. So the other precepts are a variation on that. They're a variation, again, on this idea of non-separation between self and other. So it's really opening up to this non-difference. And it's been quite interesting, again, looking at the George Floyd incident, where that really seemed to hit a spot for many people. We were able to not be separate from that experience and realize the inhumanity of that, of the harm done there and the willful harm that's done there. So the powerful efficacy of karma, of taking responsibility for our own actions of body, speech, and mind. The Dharma is clear that whatever mental state, certainly any negative mental state we have, if we are to achieve freedom, we have to let go. In fact, we have to let go of positive and negative mental states. We just let go. We cannot hold on to anything whatsoever. On a practical level, it's knowing subtly when to fight for justice, if you like, and when to let go. And that's something that we have to all work out as individuals. The Dhammapada tells us that the mind is constantly recreating the world. Yes, and if you like, we need to seek to avoid being slaves to our own negative mental states. Yeah? So we are quite often slaves to our emotions, slaves to our thoughts, and in particular, slaves to our negative mental states. So I'm going to read some more from the Dhammapada, because it certainly says it a lot better for me. And there is a part in there, again, which needs just a lot of reflection for ourselves and for us to work out how we bring this metta, this development of loving kindness, these actions of loving kindness to every aspect of our life. It's not a theoretical endeavor. It is our practice, our means of interacting, of participating in the altruistic dimension. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows, even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows like a shadow that never departs. Those who entertain such thoughts as he abused me, he beat me, he conquered me, he robbed me, will not still their hatred. Those who do not entertain such thoughts as he abused me, he beat me, he conquered me, he robbed me, will still their hatred. Not by hatred are hatreds ever pacified. They are pacified by love. This is the eternal law. Thank you.